Well, hello and welcome to Bio 212, Anatomy and Physiology 2, and this is for Norwalk Community College, at least this section of Norwalk Community College. And I haven't said this in a while, but I want to make sure people hear it again, that these, whatever we call these things, these preparations of slides for you. Remember, the way to use them best, of course, is to have read the textbook first, then come and listen to these, and then come to class prepared to ask questions. Okay? So this is where we left off from the last preparation. And these are, of course, the phases of the cardiac cycle, and we've already worked through those. And what I want us to do is now think about what happens when blood actually leaves the heart itself, right? So taking a look at the sounds of the heart, we can use these as metrics to figure out that blood is moving through the body, right? Obviously, the heart's beating, you know the person's alive. But there are 4 sounds to every heart cycle, or cardiac cycles, your textbook calls it, right? And there are 2 that are loud enough to be heard. The other 2 you can actually hear with practice. And they, of course, are the representations of each of the valves. And the lub is the closing of the AV valves, and the dub is the closing of the semilunar valves. And when you're listening, if you ever get the chance to practice listening, AV valves are atrioventricular valves, and the SL valves are the semilunar valves. So that means the lub is the closing of the valves as blood moves into the ventricles, and the dub is the closing of the valves as blood exits the ventricles. Okay? And where's it going? Well, it's going into the body, or it's going into the lungs. From the left ventricle, it's going to go into the body. And the volume of blood ejected from the left or right ventricle into the aorta or pulmonary trunk each minute is what you actually can calculate. And that's the stroke volume. Where did that go? That's the stroke volume. Okay. Typically, inside resting males, it's about 5.2 liters per minute at about 70 mils per beat. 75 beats, and you can see where the 75 times 70 will give you those 5.25 liters per minute. That's pumping through the body, and which means it actually go through the pulmonary and systemic circuits in a minute. Okay, well, let's just stop and think about that for a second. We start a drop of blood inside the right atria, travels to the right ventricle, goes to the pulmonary circulatory system, goes back to the left atria, then into the left ventricle, and then through the body, and it's back at the right atria inside of a minute. Okay? Now, you actually have what your textbook calls reserve, right? And, I tend to think of it more along the lines of what we could push your body into and what we can get your body to relax into. Okay? And there's a difference between the maximum cardiac output and the cardiac output at rest and what is below rest. Okay. And at average, the human body can go somewhere between 4 and 5 times the resting value, okay, of liters per minute of blood pushed. Now, how do we actually regulate this cardiac output? Well, there are 3 factors that are ensuring that the left and right ventricles pump equal volumes of blood. And we call these preload, contractility, and afterload. And that preload we've discussed, or you should, from your reading, discuss it's the degree of stretch on the heart before it actually contracts. The greater the preload increases the force, the greater of contraction. Okay, we call this the Frank-Starling law of the heart. And the more the heart fills with blood during diastole, the greater the force during systole. So preload is proportional to the end diastolic volume. And there are 2 factors that are responsible for this: the duration of ventricular diastole and the venous return, blood returning to the right ventricle. Okay. Now, contractility, of course, is the strength of that contraction, and positive ionotropic agents increase contractility, meaning that anything that's going to increase cardiac inflow into the heart. Okay. Let's draw that for you. Anything that can actually increase the individual slow voltage cardiac channels that are opening here, right, as you have a depolarization, is going to increase stroke volume. Generally, for this class, we're thinking about epinephrine and norepinephrine treatment would begin with something like digitalis. Okay? But we're thinking, because our autonomic nervous system has sympathetic and parasympathetic responsibilities, and epinephrine and norepinephrine come from the sympathetic, SYMP. Sympathetic, now we know what's going to actually cause this. There are things that can be negative ionotropic events as well. What the hell's going on there? Okay. Decreased contractility, anoxia, acidosis, some anesthetics, and anything that increases potassium inside the interstitial fluid. Okay? Afterload, the last thing we want to think about here. Pressure that must be overcome before the semilunar valves can work. And the way I am asking you guys to think about this, and definitely I'll suggest some ways to think about it, and you go figure out if it works for you. Right, so remember, we actually have our atria and ventricles and tricuspid, bicuspid. And what's going to happen, of course, is these guys open up and blood just rushes in here, stretching these guys outward, right? Stretching, and these should all have arrows like that, right? And what's going to happen now is as the contraction begins, so the electrical event has occurred, SA is depolarized, AV is depolarized. We've now caused ventricular contraction at the end of the Purkinje fibers. And there's a certain amount of pressure that has to be overcome inside of this area before these valves here will open. That's so if this is the tricuspid valve, this is the pulmonary trunk semilunar valve, and this is the aortic semilunar valve here. Okay? Increased afterload causes stroke volume to decrease. Well, blood has to remain inside of here for pump reasons, right? But the reality is you can decrease the amount or increase the amount depending on, as you increase the afterload, you should actually cause the amount that's ejected to decrease. In essence, even though it speeds up the rates of reaction, it decreases the efficiency of the capillary beds. But we'll worry about that later. How do we regulate all of this? Well, cardiac output depends on heart rate and stroke volume, and adjustments in heart rate in the short-term control of cardiac output are measured as blood pressure changes, right? Electrical and blood pressure changes. And the autonomic nervous system can change this by changing the effects of epinephrine and norepinephrine the most. Okay. So what do we mean by that? Originating inside the cardiovascular center inside the medulla. All right, let's draw a quick brain here. Cerebellum, pons, medulla. Okay, so somewhere right around here you have this cardiovascular center, CV center. Okay, and it's going to have the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches of the autonomic nervous system. Well, we know vagus is coming out of here, right? And glossopharyngeal is coming out of here. And what we want to do is we want to make sure that you remember that if this is the continuation of the spinal cord, somewhere around here, the cardiac accelerator nerves can actually exit as well. Okay? You can increase and decrease the frequency of nerve impulses by utilizing both sympathetic and parasympathetic branches. We've already gone through the idea is that both SA now and AV nodes, okay, can have their rate of spontaneous depolarization affected. Okay, and by changing that, you can enhance or decrease the effect of calcium entering that. Parasympathetic nervous system will release that acetylcholine. We've seen this before. It's going to decrease the heart rate by slowing the rate of spontaneous depolarizations. Okay? So let's finish up this by taking a look at the figure inside your textbook you should be paying attention to, right, when we're thinking about how your body knows what's going on here. So input from higher cardiovascular centers, okay, or I should say higher brain centers that send signal now into the cardiovascular system. we're thinking about your heart rate, your limbic system, what emotional state are you in, and the hypothalamus. What are the needs that have been measured, and then those will be collected and sent to the cardiovascular center. From your body, these are the receptors that are determining what's happening for movement, for the blood chemistry, and most specifically here, let's go like this, we're measuring CO2 and hydrogen protons. Okay, you can measure some oxygen, but for the purpose of this class, this is what your brain is keeping an eye out for, because if you have too much of this and too much of this, you've now changed too much physiology. Oxygen, you need that. Okay, and baroreceptors, they're going to monitor blood pressure, and we'll see where that happens in a few minutes. What's going to happen? Notice these are the blue lines traveling in, information input, sensory input. Now this is motor output, but the motor output here is part of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, it increases the heart rate, depolarization, the SA and AV nodes, okay, and increases the heart rate. That's going to give you increased contractility of both the atria and the ventricles to increase stroke volume, okay. Vagus nerve, which is the cranial nerve, what do you call it? Vagus, okay, 10, is parasympathetic, and of course that can decrease it. So this is the figure, which means there's text in that part of the book that supports all of these observations, and that's probably what you want to spend some time thinking about. Okay, but what are some of the other hormones that can do this as well inside the body? Because this is nervous system regulation. What are the chemicals inside of your body that can do this as well? So obviously hormones, epinephrine and norepinephrine, but thyroid hormone can do this as well. And hyperthyroidism tends to go along with a increased heart rate phenotype that you see, and that's just increased metabolism of each of the cardiac myocytes themselves. That's probably the safest way to think about it, right? I don't want you thinking too much about what will be causing all of this right now. Now, the cations, okay, the imbalance that can compromise pumping effectiveness is the concentration of potassium, calcium, and sodium inside of the body. And you know that there's a range for each of these. Okay, so if I was to say there's a range for calcium, it's 9 to 11. For potassium, I believe it. No, sodium is 126 to 136, I think, something like that. The equivalents, and I don't remember what potassium is off the top of my head, but if we go outside of these, just like we do anything else, it's going to change the physiology inside the body. And in this case, too high of this stops heart rate. Too low of that stops heart rate. Too low of that or too high of that stops heart rate, because now you're either super excitable or you can't have excitation at all. Okay, let's get rid of that. And here's a perfect example of what happens when you actually change activity inside of the body. So look at this in terms of, there's a couple ways to look at the cartoon. There's a couple ways like, oh my God, I'm going to kick the ball, I'm going to kick the ball, I'm going to kick the ball, and you miss, right? Okay, or you've been sprinting down the field, the ball is laying up on the pitch, and now you're going to strike it properly, and lo and behold, you're going to be excited, but you're going to be winded having gotten there. And all of these things play into our understanding of what's going on here, right? Cardiovascular center is measuring all of these to increase heart rate. The hormones that are required for that actually do increase heart rate, and therefore you increase cardiac output. Simultaneously, inside the heart itself, that increased end diastolic volume increases preload, which means as long as it's within limits, the cardiac muscle fiber is going to contract more forcefully, increasing stroke volume. Because of all of the physiology required here, you actually have increased calcium inside the extracellular fluid, and therefore increased contractility. You also have decreased arterial blood pressure during diastole, and therefore you're going to decrease the afterload. And the semilunar valves will open sooner because the blood pressure is lower. Okay? All of this leads to increased cardiac output. The athlete stops running. Well, what happens? You're not actually turning the system on at the same rate anymore, so therefore you don't need to inflate all of these values to increase the cardiac output. Remember, for all the wonderful things that happen from increasing your cardiac output, the reality is your body can only sustain it for a period of time. It is an incredible energy drain, and the efficiency inside the body decreases over time. Okay? So that's a pretty good place to stop. This is D. Again, the trajectory of this chapter was, well, can you build a heart? Okay, can you literally, let's go over here, do something like this. There's your, start with that, right? Now put in muscle, valves, fibrous skeleton, SA node, AV node, bundle of His, Purkinje fibers. Can you now innervate with parasympathetic and sympathetic innervation to not only the SA node, the AV node, but also cardiac muscle? And then can you change these, meaning calculate the cardiac output and then change them, reminding yourself that there's a specific path with which blood flows through the heart that you need to make sure you know. Okay. Have a great day. Bye.